This is lesson 103 of the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be talking about the end times tonight, something that I know people are very fascinated with. And because we're covering the entire chapter 24 of the Gospel of Matthew, this lesson might go on a bit longer than normal. So I hope you'll stick with us to the very end. I just want to remind you to subscribe to the February newsletter, which I'll probably be sending out next week. I answer your questions. I include other information about other research that I've been doing. And I also give you in the weekly free electronic newsletter my speaking engagements. This year, I'm going to be, this spring, very shortly coming up, I'm going to be in Rochester Hills, Michigan, and Pensacola, Florida, Tucson, Port Washington, Shreveport, Stockton, Fort Wayne, Glenview, St. Paul, Minnesota, and other places. But if you want to know the details, you have to subscribe to my newsletter. I will also be in San Diego one evening. So in case you want to see me locally, which is almost impossible because I'm never around on the weekends, I will be in San Diego, but that appearance is for women only, for a women's club at the Episcopal Church. But to get these details, you have to go to drjeannie.com, drjeannie.com, and click on the button under my picture, subscribe to the newsletter, make sure that you respond to the reply email that you will receive asking you to confirm. If you don't get that, check your spam folder. Let's get right to our subject, chapter 24 of Matthew's Gospel. Chapters 24 and 25 are traditionally called the eschatological discourse. And that's because the word eschaton, if you've never heard that word before, is the Greek word for last or end. And that's the word that is used to refer to the end times. For that reason, the eschaton. And our study of the end times is called eschatology. And I'm just going to spell it for you. I'll spell the word eschaton for you so you know what it looks like. E-S-C-H-A-T-O-N. Eschaton is not with a K or anything like that. E-S-C-H-A-T-O-N is the eschaton, and then you can add the ology part, or eschatology. Eschatological discourse is what we're talking about today. We're going to discuss the rapture, but that's toward the end of the chapter, so hold on for that, because there's plenty of very interesting stuff to discuss prior to that. In our last lesson, in chapter 23, the Lord pronounced woes upon the scribes and Pharisees, and a judgment, a prophetic statement of judgment, in which he warns them, and the chapter ends basically with him saying, your house is desolate. And that is a statement that is predicting the coming destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. To say your house is desolate is to say that God has abandoned them. These are the kinds of statements we heard from the prophets of the Old Testament when they were also foretelling the coming destruction of Solomon's temple. So Jesus is using the same kind of language that the prophets of old used to talk about the first temple. And that's how we're very confident that with what follows, he's really talking about the coming destruction of the second temple, the temple that was standing during the time of Christ. So here in chapter 4, we have lots of descriptions of what's going to happen about the destruction of the temple, also something about the end times in general. And then in chapter 24, we're going to hear about some parables, such as the talents and the 10 virgins, etc. I mean, that's chapter 25, after chapter 24. Now, clearly we're talking about two different moments in history. We're talking about the absolute end times, the end of the world, which is what we usually think of when we think of the end times. But also in this earlier part, he's talking about the coming destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. Later, he talks about the second coming. Now, one of the main purposes of this chapter is to discourage a kind of anticipation of the end times, that is the coming of Christ, before it actually happens. Now, this chapter can be very confusing because initially he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but it kind of seems like he's talking about the end of the world, but he's not. He's talking first about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, later about the end of the world, but they sound very similar, and it seems like they could both apply to the end of the world because they both involve judgment. The destruction of the temple was a statement of judgment. It was the judgment of God against the corruption that was occurring in Judaism and against the fact that the Jewish people did not accept the Messiah. And frankly, the temple was no longer needed after the coming of Christ. And that's why the temple was destroyed. Now, in this area of the Bible, in this eschatological discourse, and also later at the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, it's very confusing and very difficult to decipher because in our minds, we're always trying to force these images and ideas to follow a kind of linear pattern, especially that people try to create or try to invent. But we have to understand that the Bible was written by people with an Eastern mind, with an ancient mind, and they don't follow our pattern. We have an idea of how things ought to be explained to us. It's very Western, it's very linear, it's very logical, but the Bible is not like that. It doesn't try to put everything into a chronological format so that we can understand everything, or we think we understand it perfectly. And I think that that's really to our benefit, because these things are spiritual and they can only be understood spiritually. That's why there's a great deal of mystery about these things. And that's why we shouldn't assume that everything can be explained according to a specific time frame or described or understood according to human logic. So these chapters are full of apocalyptic language and imagery. It's very traditional Jewish language for the end times, and it is not necessarily to be understood literally. It might come to pass in some ways literally, but it also is a kind of expression, a figurative expression or a symbolic expression, which everybody at the time understood to be expressing events of the end times. Now, one reason why they're not necessarily to be understood literally is because we're talking here about the actions of God, the way God behaves, and what God is like, and those things are beyond human comprehension. So just as we understand that Genesis is not necessarily describing historical events, because God does not have hands with which he shaped the clay and made Adam, and God does not have feet with which he walked in the garden. This what I'm telling you here is what Chrysostom says, that those things did not happen in a way that describes the action of God. Nonetheless, it is true. Now, we don't call that allegory. Don't make the mistake. I'm not saying that those things are allegory. When the fathers said that Genesis must be understood literally, they meant that it really happened. God really made the world. But they also said that what it describes is something simply for us to be able to comprehend God's actions, because the way God really behaved when he created the world would be something that was beyond our ability to comprehend. So it is told in this way. It is real. It really happened, but not necessarily in a way that we can comprehend. So we have to be very careful when we're talking either about Genesis and creation or about the end of the world, that we not become so rigid in our thinking that we assume that we can understand everything according to what we can relate to in this life. Okay, according to human logic and the human brain, because these things are beyond our ability to comprehend. So here we're talking really about the unfolding of the end times, and that's not going to be something that is simple or easy to comprehend. Now, many people spend a lifetime analyzing these scriptures, and they behave as though, and they often conclude that they have unlocked the mysteries of the end times, as if they have some kind of secret insight, or they sometimes treat the Bible like it's a set of clues that if you only unlock it and you do certain calculations, you're going to be able to understand everything. This is a fool's errand. And it is always motivated by pride, even if the person doesn't think they're acting out of pride. Now, one of the most recent examples was experienced by a lot of us who can remember this back in 2011 when a Protestant preacher who had a Bible study that was heard by literally millions of people on a big radio network called Family Radio, Brother Harold Camping, predicted that the Lord would return on May 21st, 2011. And a lot of people believed him, and he was adamant that this would happen. And in the years leading up to this, because he announced this a few years in advance, in the years leading up to it, people would call up his radio show and say, but Brother Harold, Jesus says you can't know. And he says, well, he wants you to know. And I've been studying this stuff for 75 years, and I've done my calculations. And he was adamant that the Lord would return on May 21st, 2011. So, it doesn't, of course, he was wrong. It doesn't matter. And the Greeks would say, masakana rizili. In other words, he made all Christians look like fools because the media got wind of this only a couple of weeks before May 21st. And they made it look like most Christians or a lot of Christians believed in this. And it was really just a fringe element. But many people did believe him. And they did a lot of things that were very detrimental to their future because they believed that Jesus was coming back on May 21st, 2011. My point is that we should never, ever listen to these people, even if they draw out some elaborate explanation and they tell us that they're convinced that they've come up with the clues and the answer. And he based all of his ideas on calculations about the end of the world based on the flood. Okay, it is absolute nonsense. I just want you to remember that no one who has ever predicted the coming of Christ or the end of the world has ever been right. And a lot of people have tried. So still people, and they don't stop trying. So still people are believing human beings and they're following human logic and human people who say that they know how or when the end of the world will take place. It's not just when, but how. People create elaborate scenarios and they're convinced that they're right. And I'm telling you that they're not because they don't know the mind of God. These things are mysteries and we need to stop focusing on that and instead focus on being prepared for the end whenever that comes. But that's not as much fun as thinking that you have the ability to unlock the mysteries of the universe and know all these things which are obscure in the scriptures. They're obscure for a reason. The Lord does not want us to know not only when this will happen, but exactly how things will play out. There are enough clues for us to be prepared, but we're not supposed to be so proud as to think that we can know these things. This is something that is really based on human pride. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. So let's begin our study of Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was going away. This was where he had denounced the scribes and the Pharisees. When his disciples came to him and pointed out to him the buildings of the temple, but he answered them, "You see all of these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So this was an extraordinary thing to say. He describes the destruction of the temple and says there will not be one stone left upon another. And this is something that always fascinated me because I didn't understand how that was possible. Of course, it did happen. Not that how it was possible, but why did it happen? Why did it happen that the temple of Jerusalem there was nothing left, not one stone? And you go to many places in the ancient world, and we do see what remains of many ancient structures. Sometimes it's just a column or two, like at Delphi or at Cape Sunion in Greece or other places, the Roman Forum, where you see some things standing. Most of it is gone, but something is left. In the case of the temple at Jerusalem, nothing is left. Not one thing, not one stone is left upon another. And I often wondered why that was the case when we did have ancient ruins of other temples. And I described the temple in detail in the Search the Scriptures live lesson of November 5th, 2024. And I did this as we were talking about the cleansing of the temple the week later, a week after that, on November 12th, 2024. I talked about the cleansing of the temple. The week prior, November 5th, 2024, I described what the temple was like. And this will give you a clue as to why not one stone was left upon another. And that has to do with the immense quantity of gold coinage, of gold utensils like bowls and things like this that were used in worship, and the amount of gold that was used to decorate the interior of the temple, especially the Holy of Holies. And when the temple caught fire in the year 70 during the Jewish War, the gold melted, and it went in between all the cracks of the stones. And later, people went, after the destruction of the temple in the Jewish War, they went to the site and they tried to scrape the gold from the temple, from what was left, because of course it was very valuable. And in that effort, they were taking apart every single stone. And some of the stones were massive, but they pried them apart to get the gold that had melted and dripped in between the stones. So nobody could imagine that these massive stones would be taken apart. And why would they be taken apart? But of course, they didn't know what was going to happen. Only the Lord knew. So remember, so he foretells the destruction of the temple. And this is pretty shocking. And this, by the way, will be the first charge which is brought against the Lord at his upcoming Jewish trial, which we will hear about in chapter 26. 27, we're going to start the chapters 26 and 27. We're going to start the Passion. The Lord will go on trial before the Sanhedrin, and that is going to be the charge leveled against him. And you might think, well, why is that a charge, a criminal charge, a serious charge? Well, to say that the temple would be destroyed was to say that God will abandon you. And that's exactly what he was saying at the end of chapter 23, when he said, your house will be left desolate. The house is the house of the Lord. It will be left desolate. And this was a very serious thing to say. And the prophet Jeremiah foretold the destruction of Solomon's temple, and he was sentenced to death for making that prediction. Now, that actual sentence was not carried out, but he was sentenced to death for predicting the destruction of Solomon's temple. So for the Lord to say that the temple would be destroyed was very, very shocking, not to mention impossible, apparently impossible, because of the size of it, because of the size of the stones, which I've already described to you, some of which were the size of a bus. They were huge, immense, weighing many, many tons. Let's continue here with chapter 24 of Matthew. Verse 3. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us when this will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age? And Jesus answered them, take heed that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Now, when I began by telling you that here in this eschatological discourse, we're talking about two different events, if you will. One is the destruction of the temple, and it was the entire city of Jerusalem that was destroyed, but mostly the temple. That was the important part. There's that, and there's the actual end times, the coming of the end of the world, which comes with the coming of the Lord, the second coming of the Lord. Chrysostom also says that here the disciples are asking two different questions. That's why this chapter is so confusing, because part of it seems to apply to the closer, nearer future, the future for the disciples at that time, which is past for us. And some of it is applying to something which is still in the future for us. And again, I'm telling you this because we can see how wise and how accurate Chrysostom is as he analyzes this passage. And I'm relying primarily on him because his analysis is excellent. It's not carried away by flights of fancy or imagination that we see among a lot of contemporary interpreters, nor does he try to place everything as having to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. So Chrysostom notes that two questions are being asked by the disciples. It's very obvious here in verse 3. When will the temple be destroyed, and what will be the signs of Christ's second coming? So, by the way, we should also remember that when he speaks about the end of the age or the end of the world, this does not necessarily mean, it's not referring to the end of all time when he says the end will not come yet. The end of an era can mean the end of a historical era, a period of time, but not necessarily the very end, the end of the world. So first he's speaking about the end of the era, and that is this when the second temple stood. So they're sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives is a beautiful vantage point from which you can see the city of Jerusalem. They left the temple. That means they left the city of Jerusalem. They went down a very steep gorge called the Kidron Valley, and they ascended to the other side of the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of the city of Jerusalem. And from that vantage point, they could see the entire city, and they could see the temple gleaming in the sun with all of its gold. And the Mount of Olives is very important historically. It is Zechariah predicted that the Lord will return, coming to the Mount of Olives. Ezekiel talked about the glory of the Lord stopping on the Mount of Olives when the glory of the Lord abandoned the temple the first time, and that was the Temple of Solomon. So they asked the Lord about the destruction of the temple, something extremely shocking. And of course, he encourages them not to be led astray and not to become unnerved, not to become disturbed by these events, and tells them that many will come in his name, saying, I am the Christ, and many will lead people astray. This is specifically mentioned in the book of Acts. It is mentioned by Flavius Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, that there were people in the first century, right after the time of Christ, who claimed to be the Messiah and did lead people astray. Also, in the second century, there is a very famous Jewish leader called Simon Bar Kokhba, who claimed to be the Messiah. This is around the year 135. He also led a revolt against the Romans that ended in disaster for the Jewish people, but he claimed to be the Messiah also. But this has happened throughout Jewish history. There have been people who claim to be the Messiah, even not necessarily only among the Jews, but there have been false messiahs that have come even in our age. In the 1970s, there was a popular cult called the Moonies. Some of you might remember them. These were followers of Sun Myung Moon, a so-called reverend, a Christian preacher, so-called, from Korea. He claimed to be Christ. And so did David Koresh, who led a cult of Christians in Waco, Texas, that ended very tragically. He also claimed to be Jesus Christ. Charles Manson claimed to be Jesus Christ, and he had followers. You know, these things have continued to happen since the time of Christ. Many people have claimed to be Christ, but the Lord said that the time will not come just yet, even though there will be messianic pretenders in the first century. Chrysostom warns us and tells us he's still speaking about the events that are to come soon after the time of Christ's departure from this world. What's going to happen during the lifetimes of people who actually knew Jesus Christ. The end will not come yet. And of course, he speaks about nations rising against nations and earthquakes and famines and things like this. But here, of course, he's not talking about things that are going to happen throughout the world, but what is going to happen in Palestine, in that area, prior to the start of the Jewish war. So the Jewish war was from the year 66 until 73, but the important date is the year 70. That's the date that the temple was destroyed. Now, this was not an act of anti-Semitism. People say, oh, the Romans came and they destroyed the Jewish temple. The Romans didn't wake up one day and say, let's just go destroy the Jewish temple because we hate the Jews. The Romans really didn't care. They actually admired the Jewish temple. I don't think they would have willingly destroyed it. It was destroyed by accident when it caught fire. But why did the Romans come to Judea? Because the Jews revolted against the Romans and started what is commonly called the Jewish War, or sometimes the Roman Jewish War. And this ranged from the year 66 to 73. But even though they initially seemed to be having some military success when they started revolting against Rome in the year 66, the Jews weren't fighting the Romans everywhere in the Roman Empire, only in Judea. The Jews started the war. It was a war of liberation. They believed that they could throw off the Roman occupation and achieve their freedom. Most people thought they were nuts, but they succeeded nonetheless in starting a war around the year 66. Now, initially they were winning because the Romans did not have enough troops in Palestine to put down this entire revolt. But by the year 67, the Roman general Vespasian arrived with additional troops from Rome, and he went straight to Jerusalem. He surrounded the city and put it under siege for 3 years. And that event, the siege of Jerusalem, and its final, they weren't able to conquer the city, to get into it until the year 70. And when they did, this is when the temple caught on fire and burnt to the ground. But this was one of the worst events of Jewish history. As a matter of fact, it was considered the worst event, the greatest tragedy of the Jews until the Holocaust, when more people died in the Holocaust, obviously, millions of people. But prior to this, the destruction of the Temple at Jerusalem was considered the worst disaster ever to befall the Jewish people. It was absolutely horrific. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later. Let's take a break at this time, and we'll continue with the predictions of the Lord. Okay? Join me after the break.
The existence of fools for Christ in the Orthodox tradition mystifies many people, even some within the Orthodox Church itself. People often wonder what purpose these sometimes comical and oftentimes tragically misunderstood saints serve in the life of the Church, especially given their unconventional and seemingly bizarre behaviors. In Holy Fools by Oswin Creighton, we begin to gain a better understanding of these saints' curious manner of serving Christ, as we learn about the extraordinary lives of 20 of the most well-known fools for Christ in a series of brief hagiographies. Available now at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so let's continue with verse 9 of Matthew 24. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. But he who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Let's begin here with verse 9. They will deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death, and you will be hated for my sake. The Lord already predicted this for the apostles. In the Beatitudes, he says, for so men persecuted the prophets who were before you. In the missionary discourse, remember that? That's chapter 10 of Matthew's gospel. He tells them they will be delivered up to councils and dragged before governors and kings and flogged and hated for his name's sake. This is repeated in all of the gospels, including Gospel of John, where he speaks about the persecution that the apostles will suffer. And then reminds us that he who endures to the end will be saved. When persecuted in one town, they should flee to the next, etc. But the persecution, which is not only something which is experienced by the apostles, but by all Christians, that they will be persecuted. And by the way, they were persecuted initially by the Jewish people, not by the Romans. The Romans were not interested in Christians. They weren't even aware that a little sect had developed within Judaism that called itself the Christians. The first believers were considered a sect within Judaism, and the Romans weren't really aware of their existence until the time of Nero. It's Nero who's first aware that there's a different group that has emerged out of Judaism. But prior to that, they were simply considered Jews, and so they were persecuted by other Jews because other Jews considered the followers of Jesus to be heretics, because they worshiped Jesus, they considered him to be the Son of God, etc. So this is why they were persecuted first and very, seriously by the Jews. And we also see this in the book of Acts, when Jewish people who reject the preaching of the apostles go to Roman authorities and they try to get the Romans to imprison the apostles, or they are beaten by the crowd, and the first believers are beaten by other Jews, sometimes in the sight of Romans who really don't care. They simply don't care. So this is not something that, it isn't that immediately the Romans start persecuting the Christians. They didn't, because they didn't understand what they were, and they were part of Judaism, and Judaism was a legal religion. The Romans did not persecute the Jews because of their religion. The Romans fought with the Jews because the Jews revolted against Rome. Verse 10, many will fall away and betray one another. So who's going to fall away? It's the believers who are going to fall away. Some of them will betray each other, and that is true. We see it even in the New Testament. We see warnings by apostles like Peter in his epistles to maintain the faith, not to turn to heresy. We see it in the book of Revelation with John writing about this woman, false prophet, is called Jezebel, that he calls her Jezebel, and other people who are teaching the wrong things, behaving the wrong way. There are lots of warnings against heresy and immorality directed at believers, even during the apostolic times. So the Lord foretold that this would happen, and that there would be false prophets, etc. He's also told this before at the end of chapter 7 of Matthew's gospel, when he says, Lord, Lord, did we not heal people in your name? Didn't we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons in your name? What did he say? I will say to them, I never knew you. Get away from me, you evildoers. So there are many times, even in the Gospel of Matthew, when he foretells that this will happen, that people will say that they did things in the Lord's name, and of course it wasn't true. So the love of many will grow cold. What does this mean? Well, love is supposed to be the sign of a true Christian. But in those days, Christians' love will grow cold. And this is a sign, we see this also in the book of Revelation, that it's a sign of the end of an era. But what are we supposed to do? Endure. He who endures to the end will be saved. This is a common theme in apocalyptic literature. This is an apocalyptic section in the Gospel of Matthew. In the book of Revelation, we have the same call, a constant call to the endurance of the saints. This is a call for the endurance of the saints. We are called to be faithful in times of tribulation. He who endures to the end will be saved. So here the Lord is speaking about the destruction, the coming Jewish war, and the destruction of the temple. But that statement about the need for endurance until the end is something that applies to all Christians at all times. Now, here's how we know that he's still speaking about the destruction of the temple, not the end times, the ultimate end times, the ultimate eschaton. And here he says, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now we know that many Protestants are motivated to preach the gospel to the ends of the earth so that Jesus will come back. Now, Paul also states about also talks about the Gentile mission that must be completed before the end comes. But here in this particular passage, Chrysostom points out that the end that will happen when the gospel is preached to all nations is not the end of the world, but the destruction of the temple. And he's very smart about this, and I'm going to point it out to you, and it's very obvious that he is right, because he says here that the end refers to the end of that era, and the era is the end of temple Judaism, the end of the destruction of the temple, the end of Jewish worship, the end of the sacrifices of animals, etc., not the end of the entire world. Because here in this passage, he uses the word when he says that it will be preached throughout the whole world. The world is not the word cosmos. The world is the word ecumeni. And this is not a word that lends itself to easy translation. Ecumeni is the word that's used to refer to the empire. First, it was a pagan Roman Empire, then it was a Christian Roman Empire. That word is pretty well known, certainly very well known to all Greeks, but ought to be known to all Orthodox Christians. The ecumeni is where we get our word ecumenical from. Doesn't mean many religions. The ecumeni, when we talk about an ecumenical council, we're talking about a council that involved people from throughout the ecumeni, throughout the civilized world, and that meant the Roman Empire. So here he's quoting this. It's very, very obvious that he's saying that, and Chrysostom talks about this, that their voice, from the word ecumeni, he understands this to mean that these things will happen after the gospel has gone to every part of the Roman world. And Chrysostom is right because of that word ecumeni. That is not referring to the globe, the entire globe. We have to get to every single, even isolated island or the deepest parts of the Amazon and preach the gospel so that Jesus will come back. Here he's talking about the destruction of the temple, which will not happen until the apostles reach the ends of the Roman world. And this happened in the first century. And Chrysostom goes on to quote from Psalm 19:4, which is also quoted by St. Paul in Romans chapter 12, verse 18, as he discusses the work of the apostles. And this notion should be familiar to every Orthodox Christian, because he then quotes both St. Paul and St. John Chrysostom quote this psalm: "Ispasan tinin exilthen ofongos aftu, gista perata tis igumenis darimata afton." This is our communion hymn. Every time we celebrate the feast of an apostle, this is verse 4 from Psalm 19, and St. Paul also quotes it. We are a biblical church. This is a verse from the Bible. This is what we sing as a communion hymn every time there is a feast of the apostles. If you sing in the choir, you recognize this. Their voice has gone out through all the earth, and their words throughout the ecumeni, and it's the exilthen dis ecumenis da perata dis ecumenis da rimata aphors, has gone to the end of the ecumeni. Their words have gone out to the end of the ecumeni. So Chrysostom notes that it is not that the gospel was necessarily believed by everyone, but it was preached everywhere in the ecumeni, that is the Roman Empire, within 20 or 30 years of the time of Christ. And we know about this. We know that it reached Britain, from Britain down to Egypt, and from Spain it went to India, brought there by St. Thomas. So here the Lord is clearly talking about the destruction of the temple. The temple was no longer needed because Christ the Lord had come and fulfilled it, every element of the law of Moses, and the gospel went out throughout the entire world where the Jewish people were. So this now is going to, here this shows us that the Jewish people, of course, those who did not accept Christ, many did accept Christ, but the consequence of their unbelief and the consequence of the coming of the Lord was the destruction of the temple. Why is that? Because animal sacrifice was no longer needed once Christ himself had come and died on the cross for us. How could anyone say that animal sacrifice was needed after Christ himself, the Son of God, had died for the life of the world? So when I'm telling you this, that this was God's judgment on the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple because their refusal to accept Jesus Christ. The Jews don't accept that. They don't believe that. But they do believe that the temple was destroyed because of the corruption of their leaders. And remember, it was the corruption of their leaders which led to the crucifixion of Jesus. So they are interrelated. The Jewish people cannot see that. They don't accept that. But nonetheless, the fact that the temple was destroyed because of the corruption of the temple and the Jewish leaders is something which is believed by Jews today. They were way back then and still today. So let's continue with chapter 24. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let him who is in the field not turn back to take his mantle. So here we see that they're still talking, the Lord is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and what would happen in the city of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple and what would happen to the people when the Romans came. First of all, it says, when you see the desolating sacrilege, in Greek, it's literally the abomination of desolation. And this statement, this phrase is used in the book of Daniel. And Daniel, of course, describes the sacrilege that occurred when Antiochus Epiphanes erected an idol in the Jewish temple. This is during the era of the Maccabees. So this is an abomination, a desolation, a sacrilege of the Jewish temple. And this is what happened also when the Romans finally, of course, entered Jerusalem and they entered the temple. It's about, by the way, St. Luke's gospel is very explicit. It's much more clear. He actually has the Lord saying, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know its desolation has come near. And that is exactly what happened to Jerusalem. The Romans came and they surrounded the city. They put it under siege for 3 years in order to starve the Jewish people into surrendering. It was extremely difficult to conquer the city of Jerusalem because of its very, very thick and high walls, and because it's surrounded on 3 sides by deep gorges like the Kidron Valley. So when it says, let the reader understand, this little comment is intended to let people understand and see the parallel between what happened during the era of the Maccabees and what happened at that time with the destruction of the temple. But he's saying, don't go to the city. If you see armies coming, now this is how people used to have some kind of defense. The only defense that people had in antiquity was the walls of the city. So if you saw an army coming down the road, you ran to the city. You're not going to stay in your house. There was no standing army that people had in antiquity. Safety was found in a city, behind a big gate, behind tall walls. So people tended to run to a city for refuge and for safety. And the Lord here is saying, don't go to the city, go to the hills. If you're in the field, don't even go home to get your mantle, which was something valuable. Probably the most valuable thing anyone owned was their cloak or their mantle, that big piece of fabric that you used to wrap yourself up in to sleep in. He said, don't even go to your house. If you're on the rooftop, don't go down into the house. And on the rooftop, people would lay out grapes to be dried as raisins, and they were used for sometimes sitting and sleeping and doing certain kinds of chores. But if you see that, flee immediately. Don't even go down into your house to take something, because what would happen would be so horrific. What happened to the Jewish people when the Romans came was horrible. It was It's a tragedy unlike anything that the world has ever seen. We'll get to this. Let us continue, because he's warning people who are with women who are pregnant. In verse 19, he says, "Alas for those who are with child and for those who give suck in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and will never be. And if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened." Now, shortened, it was 3 years. 3 years of absolute misery for the people who were confined to the city of Jerusalem. So he begins this little section by saying, "Alas for those who are with child." And that's because it's very difficult to flee when you're pregnant, especially when you're very far along. Or if you are giving suck, if you have small children, very, very difficult to flee from an army, to flee from danger when you're caring for small children. So he's saying, pray that your flight might not be in winter or in the Sabbath, because it's more difficult to travel in the winter and many roads were impassable. And the fact that he's referring to the Sabbath shows here that he's giving this warning to the Jews who will be around, or possibly even Christian Jews. That was Matthew's community, who might still have been observing the Sabbath, because they would feel that if they could only travel a limited distance on the Sabbath. So he's telling them about the terrible situation that they will face when the Romans came and destroyed the temple. So Chrysostom says that these warnings that the Lord is giving are not an exaggeration. He specifically says this is not hyperbole. Pray that it not happen in winter. Pray that you're not pregnant or caring for small children. Pray that this is not happening on the Sabbath. And he's saying that this is not an exaggeration. And he knows about it because Chrysostom has read the accounts of the fall of Jerusalem. And the person who wrote about this was a first century Jewish historian, Josephus, sometimes called Flavius Josephus, who wrote an account of exactly what happened during this war. And it's available. You can buy it, or you can probably find it for free on the internet. It's an entire book called The Jewish War. He begins at the beginning and talking about the rebellion against the Romans. He talked about how the Romans came finally and surrounded the city of Jerusalem, and Josephus was there when the city was taken. He was outside the city. He was a captain in the Jewish war. He was captured, and because he spoke Greek fluently, he was also a priest, by the way. So he's one of our main sources for information about the temple at Jerusalem. He's the most important Jewish historian of the first century, and his writings were preserved. Believe it or not, they were preserved by Christians. He wrote in Greek, and he was a historian for the Flavian dynasty. He was captured during the war and makes a prediction that the general who was sent by the Romans to respond to the Jewish war, he's the one who surrounded the city. His name was Vespasian. Josephus predicted that he would become the next emperor, and that came true. And after the Jewish war was over, he was taken as a prisoner to Rome, and also became the historian then of the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian was succeeded by Titus, his son, who was also surrounding Jerusalem with him. Vespasian went back to become the emperor, and Titus remained, and he's the one who finally oversees the capture of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Everything is described in great detail by Josephus. So when Chrysostom says that this is not an exaggeration what happened, how terrible it would be, he has already read, because Flavius Josephus wrote in the Greek language. That was the common language of writers of his time, not in Latin. And Chrysostom and other fathers of the church have read all of these histories. And by the way, they read other books by Josephus. And it's not an exaggeration. I'll go ahead and read to you what Chrysostom has to say about this. And this is Chrysostom's homily 76 on the Gospel of Matthew. "Do you not see that his discourse is addressed to the Jews? that he is speaking of the ills that would overtake them? For the apostles were not keeping the Sabbath day, neither were they there when Vespasian did these things, when he surrounded the city and placed the city under siege to literally starve the Jews into submission. Now, the reason why he's saying the apostles were not there is not only because it took place later in the years between the years 67 and 70, the 3 years in which the city was under siege, but the Christians did not participate in the Jewish war. The Christians were not fighting the Romans. As a matter of fact, they had received a warning from the Holy Spirit that the Romans were coming. So they had left the city of Jerusalem and had fled to Pella. But so Chrysostom knows about this. This is recorded by the earliest Christian historian. I'm not speaking about St. Luke, but about Eusebius of Caesarea. So he talks about this and how they had fled to Pella. So most Christians, the Christians of Jerusalem, did not die in the war. They had already fled. But Chrysostom thinks that some were caught up and were in the city when it was surrounded. Chrysostom continuing, for indeed the most part of them had already departed this life. He means that most of the apostles were dead by then. Well, that's true. If any was left, he was dwelling in other parts of the world. That's true because they had gone there, like Thomas, to preach the gospel. Why neither in the winter nor on the Sabbath day? Not in the winter because of the difficulty arising from the season, nor the Sabbath because of the absolute authority exercised by the law. For since they had need of flight, of the swiftest flight, neither would the Jews dare to flee on the Sabbath day because of the law. Neither in the winter was such a thing easy. Therefore he says, pray, for then there shall be tribulation, such as never was and never shall be. And let not any man suppose this to be spoken hyperbolically, but let him study the writings of Josephus and learn the truth of the sayings. For neither can anyone say that the man being a believer, he means Josephus, in order to establish Christ's words, has exaggerated the tragic history. For indeed he was both a Jew and a determined Jew and very zealous among those who lived after Christ's coming. So Josephus is not a Christian. That's Chrysostom's point. He's not writing these things to prove that what Christ said really happened. He's not a Christian. He has no interest in proving that what Christ said really happened. He does mention Jesus Christ. He does mention that he was crucified by the Jewish leaders. He does mention that he was a great wonder worker. So Josephus knows about Jesus Christ and mentions him briefly. He also talks about James, and he also mentions John the Forerunner and Baptist. So he mentions all the leading Jewish figures of his time, the first century. Let's continue with Chrysostom. But his point is that Josephus is not making this up when he speaks about when Christ says that there has never been such a horrible thing to happen in the history of the world, never been such tribulation, and never will be. Chrysostom is saying that Christ is not exaggerating, and if you don't believe that Christ is not exaggerating, read the history recorded by Flavius Josephus in his book, The Jewish War, and you will read all about it. So continuing with Chrysostom, what then does this man say? That those terrors surpassed all tragedy, that no such had ever overtaken the nation, for so great was their famine that the very mothers fought about the devouring of their children, and that there were wars about this. And he said many others, when they were dead, had their bellies ripped up. In other words, people were so consumed by desire for food when the Romans besieged the city for 3 years. Imagine that. The city is under siege for 3 years, and the Romans did not allow any food to enter the city. And people went crazy inside out of hunger. It's described quite graphically. I used to assign this reading or some of these chapters to my students when I was teaching about the early church, what happened to the Jewish people in the year 70 and the year 67 to 70, the 3-year siege of Jerusalem. I could not assign the worst parts. They are almost impossible to read. They're so horrific, the description that he makes. Now, if you choose to read about this, you will see that Josephus is saying that within the city of Jerusalem, the Jews themselves were fighting amongst themselves. There were factions, each who wanted to control the city because they believed that the temple would never be destroyed. They believed that God would come to their aid. And there were two factions. There was a little civil war going on inside the city as the Romans were outside trying to conquer the city. And if you read it, you will see that there was one faction that was led by John and another faction that was led by Simon. Do not think that those are the apostles. They're not the apostles. Simon and John fighting each other, leading gangs of people inside the city of Jerusalem. Just because they have the names of apostles, that it's just because they were common names. So if you read about this, don't assume that they're apostles. They're Simon and John. These were leaders of these gangs who were fighting for control inside the city while the Romans were outside trying to conquer the city. And because they were fighting each other, they were terrorizing the people inside who were just trying to survive. People would try to go outside the city at night, sneak outside, and try to just get some grass that was growing between the rocks so that they would have something to eat. But if they were caught by the Romans, they were crucified in the sight of everybody. They were caught outside and they were crucified. It was horrific. But what Chrysostom refers to is cannibalism. Yes, that's what Josephus describes, mothers eating their own children, and also people eating corpses because people died of famine. So it's a horrific thing. I don't advise that you read it, but if you want to read it, you can. It's available. It's been preserved, this history. And when the Lord says that there's never been such suffering in the history of the world, and that there never will be, thank God, I hope that there never is anything like this. But this is what happened to the Jewish people when they revolted against Rome. So, and he continues by saying, if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. It did take 3 years. It was horrible. But that's short as compared to what it could have been longer. And some people did survive. There were thousands who did survive. They became slaves of the Romans. Some were killed by the sword. When the Romans finally entered the city, they killed a lot of people. There was fighting inside the city, of course. They killed all the elderly people. They killed all the very young. But the people who were who were relatively young adults, teenagers, and children who could work, they made into slaves, and other people were sent to the mines, which was considered a fate worse than death. But this is also described by Flavius Josephus, what happened to the people who survived. And many, many, many people were crucified. They deforested the entire area, building crosses to crucify thousands of people who survived the siege of Jerusalem. So he says the elect will be saved. So some people, Chrysostom believes that some Christians were caught up in this and were stuck in the city of Jerusalem when the Romans finally came. But this idea of the shortening of the time so that some people would survive is also kind of a common apocalyptic motif. Now, at this point, the discussion turns from what will happen in the near future to the Jewish people in Jerusalem and to the Jewish temple, and it turns here in verse 23 to the end times. So we will discuss that after our break.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are central events in our salvation. Yet few Christians have a good grasp of the first-century historical and religious context in which the crucifixion took place, nor of its true significance for the people of that time, and hence for our time as well. In her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, biblical scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantinou puts modern readers in the center of the events of Christ's Passion, bringing the best of modern scholarship to bear while keeping her interpretation faithful in every particular to the early church tradition. If you love Search the Scriptures live on Ancient Faith Radio, you'll also love The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, available now at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
All right, let's continue now when he turns to the end times, actual end times, what we think of as the end of the world. Verse 23, Matthew 24, verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, lo, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Lo, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, lo, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will gather together. Now, Chrysostom mentions the fact that this new section begins with the word then. And he explains that this does not mean immediately thereafter. That's how we ordinarily take the word then, to refer to something happening immediately thereafter. But the scripture has its own way of conveying the passage of time, and using the word then is actually one of the ways that the scriptures convey that time will pass before this next thing happens. So first he was talking about the end of their era, which is the destruction of the temple. And then he's going to discuss the end times, the eschaton. And we see that, for example, at the beginning of chapter 3 in Matthew's gospel, when it comes to the preaching of John, chapter 2 ends with the infancy narratives, and then it says immediately, in those days, and des imanis aquinas, or sometimes endokero aquino, we see in like the Gospel of Luke, at that time, in those days, at that time. It's showing you by that language actually a passage of time. So Jesus is a boy. Actually, he's a little baby at the end of Matthew chapter 2, and then it begins in Matthew chapter 3, in those days. In what days? He does not, and he starts talking about John the Baptist. He's not talking about back when Jesus was an infant. It's a phrase that is used to indicate the passage of time, and so does the word then here, okay? So we do hear this in church, and pay attention to this. Usually it's at the very beginning of the gospel reading, and the priest will say, in those days, and then he'll go on to talk about something. So, verse 24, false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders and lead people astray, possibly even the elect. Chrysostom says that this refers to the Antichrist, and yes, it does, because we are told that he will do signs and wonders. And we have to be very careful not to be deceived. We have to be very careful not to listen to anyone. The Lord says, lo, I have told you beforehand. Don't listen to false prophets. Don't follow false Christs. I have told you beforehand. In other words, he's telling us not to pay attention to these people. We are not to follow people, no matter how sincere they seem, no matter how holy they seem, no matter how many people there are who are following them. We should not listen to people who tell us that they know when the end is near or how this is going to take place or anything of the sort. And it's very tempting. A lot of people are extremely fascinated by this idea, and they want to believe that somebody knows when the end will come. And I think that's maybe why they follow these people. We should not listen to this. We saw this, whether a person is Orthodox or not. I'm not just telling you not to listen to false Catholic or false Protestant prophets. There are false Orthodox prophets. Yes, there are. And we saw this during COVID. And a lot of people got very worked up about this. And we had people telling us that the COVID vaccine was the sign of the beast. And I'm like, how can that be the sign of the beast? That would mean that the end of the world is at hand. And why should we believe that that's the sign of the beast? Because some monk said so? Some holy person said so? You know, they can be wrong. They can absolutely be wrong. And we're not supposed to be swept up in these things and follow these people and believe them. The Lord said, lo, I have told you beforehand. That means we're supposed to listen to him, not go looking for holy people to tell us what the signs of the end times are. That's actually not orthodox at all. We know what is orthodox, and we hear it every Holy Week. We have to be prepared for the end. We're not supposed to be looking for prophets, following false prophets, because people can have very good intentions. and be completely wrong. We're not supposed to follow people and look for people who are making predictions. And unfortunately, this is a kind of popular development recently in the Orthodox world, which I do not understand. Okay? The Lord said, I have told you beforehand. What does that mean? There will be false prophets. If you think you can determine whether a prophet is false? You're not going to know until their prophecy does not come true. Well, whoever said that the COVID vaccine was the sign of the beast was a false prophet, because it's not the end times. The beast isn't here. The Antichrist isn't here. Can't you tell that? So anybody who was promoting this hysteria was clearly wrong, which means they are a false prophet. We should not be listening to them under any circumstances. We'll get to what we're supposed to be doing in a moment. Here's verse 26. So if they say to you, lo, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, lo, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. So when he talks about it in the wilderness or in the inner rooms, he's not going to be outside. He's not going to be inside. He's not going to be visible until he comes. There was a certain messianic expectation that the Messiah would suddenly appear in the wilderness. I think we talked about this in the Gospel of John. Because people were saying when the Messiah comes, nobody will know where he comes from. And it was one of the reasons why people were fascinated by the John the Baptist, that he would be suddenly emerge out of some obscurity. But here the Lord is saying that when he comes, it will be visible to all. It will be obvious to all. It will be unmistakable. And he makes this comparison to eagles or vultures gathering. In other words, when you see, I don't know if you've ever seen this, if you see, or you've seen it certainly in movies, where there's like a dead body of an animal or something, and then the vultures or the eagles are circling around it. They're circling so that they can go down and start eating it. That's an unmistakable sign. Everybody knows what that means. And so his point is that the coming of Christ will be very obvious. Now, let us continue. Verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear the Son of Man in heaven. All the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branches become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So here we have something else which is kind of confusing, because he says, this generation will not pass away. We're going to get to that. He's not talking about the generation that he's speaking to. They're the apostles. There are two distinct time periods that he's talking about here. First is the time period that is referencing the destruction of the temple, which was within the lifetime of the apostles, even though all of them did not live to see it. And then you have a later time when he's talking about this generation, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, what will be the signs of the time? These are apocalyptic signs. These are common apocalyptic signs. But I can tell you that if you see the stars falling from the sky and the moon and the sun going dark, etc., then you can be kind of worried that maybe Jesus is coming again, or maybe be excited that Jesus is coming again. But his point is that the signs will be obvious. There will be cosmic signs of the end. We have not seen that. Okay, we will not see that until the end. These are signs that are typical of in Jewish tradition, but they are things that we do see with times of great disasters, the fires in California recently. I can tell you that the sky was orange. The sky was darkened from all of the smoke. And you see this when there's tremendous destruction, the moon turns dark, the sky turns dark, even in the daytime, the sun becomes red, the moon becomes red. And these are apocalyptic signs because they're associated with tremendous upheaval and disaster. But it's not just one disaster, like fires in California, or even a very severe disaster, like the tsunami that happened, like in 2003, or whenever that was, even with great deaths. That's not a sign of the end times. If we have those kinds of disasters throughout the world, then maybe you can suggest, or might suggest, the end times. But one big disaster, a big earthquake, a big tsunami, a big, fire, that is not a sign of the end times. That's kind of normal. That's how things are. We have disasters. It is not the end. So the Son of Man will come. He will be seen. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. They're going to regret him. The people who don't believe will regret him. And of course, we know that everyone is going to see Christ when he comes. And this is something which seemed impossible to understand. How was this possible? But today, we have smartphones, don't we? We see things instantly. And things are posted on YouTube and on TikTok and other platforms immediately. So, and people have cell phones in places in Africa and rural areas. So the idea that everybody could experience the same thing around the world at the same time seemed impossible, but not so much anymore. So it is possible that everyone will see the Lord when he comes. I don't know if it will happen in a mystical way or a spiritual way, or simply because of technology, we will all see the Lord when he comes. I don't know how that's going to happen, but it's certainly something which is physically possible today, which might not have been possible, or something seemed possible even 10 years ago. And what's going to happen? The people who do not believe, they will mourn, and they will see him coming in glory in the clouds of heaven. This description of the coming of the Son of Man is taken from the book of Daniel. Jesus makes the same claim at his upcoming trial, which we will see in chapter 26. And when he comes, he's going to send the angels to gather the elect. This again is something which we see commonly in apocalyptic texts in the Old Testament. And what does this mean? This shows us that here we have the image of judgment. Everybody's going to be gathered together. We are not gearing up for anything like a rapture, and I will show you why this is not suggesting anything like what is commonly described of as the rapture. Again, he's telling us that when we see these things happening, it's going to be obvious. So we shouldn't be looking at this times. I've had people tell me that they came from a Christian tradition, in which they would, read about events like in the Middle East, or what's Netanyahu doing now, what's happening, this earthquake, this tsunami, this fire, and they're trying to figure all of that into the book of Revelation. When the end comes, my dear brothers and sisters, it will be obvious to everyone. That's what the Lord is saying here. You shouldn't be trying to decipher the signs of the times, because people have been doing that for their whole lifetimes. Oh, Jesus is coming back very soon, very soon, very soon. And they've been wrong. They've all been wrong. So relax, okay? Stop trying to do that. It doesn't work. When the Lord comes back, it will be obvious to everyone. This is why he uses the image of the fig tree. Too bad Father Costa isn't here to talk again about the fig tree. This point is that the tree loses all of its leaves in the wintertime. And when it begins to sprout buds and green leaves in late spring, you know that it's about to produce fruit. It's a reliable sign. It's predictable. It's obvious. This is what he's trying to say. When you see this, the obvious signs, then you will know that the Lord is near. So now, what about this statement? Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. What does this mean, this generation? This is where people get confused. How can he be talking about Jerusalem? Is this referring to the coming destruction of Jerusalem? No. The word yenea can mean a lot of things. Generation, it's the Greek word yenea, can mean a lot of things. Some people think it refers to the people of Israel. Christendom thinks it refers to the believers. Okay, and I think he's absolutely right about that. It is the believers, this generation. It doesn't mean the people who are alive at the time that Christ is speaking, but that the generation, we even use that kind of language in the church, Lord save your people, and this kind of reference to not only the Laos, the people, but also this generation that the generation is the continuation of the people, that this is something which is also a very biblical thing. And he reminds us that this is true, it's going to happen. Heaven and earth may pass away, but my words will not pass away. And this helps us. We recall a similar statement by the Lord in Matthew 5 at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, when he says, "Not a dot, not a iota will pass away of my words of the law." And this can you see how the eschatological discourse is mirroring the beginning of the first great, this is the last of the great teaching sections of Matthew's gospel in its length and in some of its content in terms of what the believers should expect and do, is mirroring what we saw in the first teaching discourse of Matthew's gospel, chapters 5, 6, and 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount. So what are we supposed to do? Well, we're supposed to be vigilant. We're supposed to be always prepared. Verse 36, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only." Now, this phrase is one that attracts a lot of attention, and people, again, find it very confusing. And they don't understand, how is it possible that the Son does not know the day or the hour? Is that possible? And the answer, of course, is no. It is not possible for the Lord not to know the day or hour. But people create actually heresies from this and other verses that they don't understand correctly. But it creates a kind of Christological questions. And Chrysostom is absolutely clear. All of the fathers are absolutely clear that the Lord is not saying he doesn't know. Okay? He's saying, don't ask me about it. This is for the Father. He's not expressing ignorance. There is no such thing as ignorance in the Son of God. Any statements like that lead you to think, oh, Jesus is saying he doesn't know. He's not speaking in his human nature or anything like that. We cannot separate the divine nature from the human nature. He knows everything. As the incarnate Son of God, he knows everything. So how do we know that? Because it's the only logical explanation. It doesn't matter that he says, oh, the Son doesn't know, the Father only. It doesn't matter. He's obviously not trying to indicate that he really doesn't know. He's trying to put us off and say that this is not for you to know. Because he says the angels don't know, nobody knows, don't ask me about it. Now, how can we be certain of this? Chrysostom talks about this at great length. And basically he's saying, how can the Lord not know something? It's utterly impossible. He knows it, but he's not revealing it because they are not to know. And he's trying to discourage them from asking. Because it's not good for us to know. We all want to know when the end of the world is going to be, but it's not good for us to know. So St. John Chrysostom is saying that he does not reveal the end of the world, nor does he reveal the date or the hour of our death, so that we will always be prepared and be vigilant. So I'm going to read Chrysostom for you in homily 77 on the Gospel of Matthew. By saying that not even the angels know, he stopped their mouths, that they should not seek to learn what even the angels do not know. By saying neither the Son, he forbids them not only to learn, but even to inquire. So this is a very good lesson for us. We are not supposed to try to make predictions about the end or seek to find out when the end is coming. We're not supposed to do this. This is really not in the Orthodox tradition. It's not been our tradition to do this, but there have been a lot of groups who have, including other Christian groups sects like the Seventh-day Adventists. Certainly the Jehovah's Witnesses have done a lot of this predicting. other Christians, like this fellow Harold Camping I told you about earlier. There have been a lot of people who made predictions. We are not supposed to do this. We're not even supposed to ask. And why not? Because it's not good for us. Because God always wants what is best for our souls, what is best for our salvation. So here is St. John Chrysostom. Let's continue with his comments. For proof that therefore he said this, see after his resurrection, when he saw that they have become overly curious, he stopped their mouths more decidedly. Now here he's referring to when at the beginning of Acts, in Acts chapter 1, after the resurrection, the disciples say to him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Again, they want to know the time frame. And what does he say? He doesn't say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. Don't even ask me. He says, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put under his authority. So he does not want us to ask. Okay, why? Because then look what's happening. Look what's happening among most Protestants today who believe in the rapture. They spend all their time obsessing about how and when the Lord will return. They're not looking at their spiritual lives so much, and how, or certainly many people are not, how they can improve their spiritual lives, what they can do until the Lord comes. Instead, they're obsessed. Many people are absolutely, utterly obsessed with this, and it is a complete waste of time, not only because we cannot know, but because it's not good for us to know. Okay? So, here's St. John Chrysostom. They were overly curious, and he stopped their mouths more decidedly. For now, indeed, he mentioned signs, many and endless ones. But then he said merely, it is not for you to know the times and seasons. He says, which the Father has placed under his own power. And this because he was exceedingly careful to honor them and not conceal anything from them. In other words, Chrysostom is saying that the Lord didn't want the disciples to think that he was hiding them things from him. So he says, listen, that's up to my Father. That belongs to the Father. Since if it is not this, but he is ignorant of it, when will he know it? So this is Chrysostom's analysis, and it is perfect. In other words, either the Son really knows, or he does not actually know. Either he really knows and he's not telling us because he doesn't think we should be asking about it. We shouldn't be obsessing about the end times. This is not for us to know. And so he kind of deflects it by saying this is the Father's business, or he really doesn't know. It can only be one or the other. He either really knows and says, don't ask me. And he says basically by saying, this is for the Father to know, because they're not going to go ask the Father. They have Jesus there. He says, this is for the Father to know, not for you to know. Either he really knows and he's deflecting them and trying to stop their curiosity, or he doesn't know. Which one is it? So that Chrysostom begins his analysis. If he's ignorant of it, when will he learn of it? Along with us? In other words, is Jesus really in the dark and he's only going to find out about his second coming when it's time for him to come along with the rest of us? Who could say this? And the Father knows clearly, and even as clearly as he knows the Son, of that day he is ignorant. Remember, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, the Son knows the Father knows the Son, that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. No one knows the Father but the Son, and he knows everything, has placed everything under his authority. How can you then say that the Son does not know? How can there be ignorance in the Son? It is utterly impossible theologically to say that the Son does not know, which means that Jesus is deflecting the curiosity of the disciples by saying this, trying to get them to stop asking him. Now remember, we have only a small portion of this discussion in the Gospel of Matthew. We can read this whole thing in 15 minutes, the whole chapter in less than 15 minutes. Don't you think that the actual discussion went on much longer? Yes, it did. Wouldn't you be talking to the Lord about it for much longer? Yes. So, but at a certain point, he wants to end the discussion and the speculation, and he says, this is for the Father. Nobody knows. The Son doesn't know. Now, does this mean that the Lord is lying? No, it means that he's trying to get them to be quiet and stop asking him. Okay? Because we can't conclude that Jesus is lying. That's a sin, right? It can't be that. He has his reason, his ways of speaking, has his ways of teaching them. He has his ways of, certainly, they were persistent in wanting to know more about it. And he said, this is not for you to know. It's for the Father to know. Here he says the Son doesn't know. The angels don't know. Nobody knows. It's the Father's business. Don't ask me about it. So again, Chrysostom says, for example, if it's just the Father, that also means the Spirit doesn't know. So Chrysostom says, moreover, the Spirit indeed searches even the deep things of God, and he does not know even the time of the judgment. Well, how ought he judge? He knows, and Jesus, the same thing. The Son of God knows and has full perception of the secrets of every person. I mean, Jesus can read people's thoughts, and he doesn't, because he's God, and he doesn't know the time of the end, the day of judgment. He has full perception of the secrets of each, and of what is far more common than this. How could he be ignorant? And how? If all things were made by him, and without him was not one thing made, the Son of God made the world, he made the entire universe, how can he be ignorant of the day of judgment? Chrysostom points this out. For he who made the worlds, it is quite plain that he made the times also. And if the times he even made that day, how then can he be ignorant of what he made? So Chrysostom is quite adamant, and he's right, because that's the only possible answer. The Son cannot be ignorant, otherwise he's not God. Now you're in heresy. Okay, and of course, he answers extensively the people who said, and the Arians were claiming that this is one reason why the Son is not equal to God the Father, why the Son of God is not fully God. Well, if the Son of God is not fully God, he's not God at all, because you can't be sort of God. You're either God or you're not God. If you're not God, if Jesus Christ is not God, fully God, equal to God the Father, equal to the Spirit, if he's not God, then we're not saved. So can you see how impossible it is to suggest in any way, shape, or form that the Son of God does not know the time of judgment, the time of the end? Of course he knows. But he got tired of the disciples asking him. So he said, listen, this is about the Father. The Father knows. The Son doesn't know. The angels don't know. Nobody knows. The Father only. Okay? And that's the only explanation. That in his wisdom, he decided to answer the question in that way. It is also not for us to judge him and say, oh, Jesus is lying. Be careful about these things. So there are certain things that are obvious that cannot be true, even though on their face they seem to be explicitly true. The Son does not know. Of course the Son knows. In spite of the fact that he is saying that he does not know, he has to know. It's impossible for him to be God and not know. Okay, it's impossible for him to create the world and everything in it and not know. It's impossible for him to be one with the Father and to have all things placed in his hands. He's the one who's going to judge the world and not know when. It's impossible to reach that conclusion. That is Chrysostom's conclusion. Okay, we're going to take a break at this point. When we come back, we're going to talk about the rapture, which you've been waiting for, I'm sure. So join me after the break.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
So let us continue now in verse 37, Matthew chapter 24, verse 37. As were, the Lord is still speaking. As were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they did not know until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. So here, what he's saying is that the Lord will come suddenly, and the people who are sinning will not be prepared for the coming of the Lord. So here's St. John Chrysostom, homily 77 on Matthew. By the way, I did find some really nice other patristic statements. I'm going to share them with you a little bit in the future, maybe when we get to the Last Judgment, because we simply don't have time for all those patristic statements. This is a rather long lesson. St. John Chrysostom, their insensibility to be such as those of Noah's time, for that amid such evils they lived in luxury. But not so the righteous, but they were passing their time in tribulation and dejection. And Noah was. Noah was kind of persecuted and made fun of and mocked, wasn't he? Right? Whereby he shows that when the Antichrist comes, the pursuit of unlawful pleasures shall be more eager among the transgressors, and those that have learned to despair of their own salvation. That's interesting, isn't it? So transgressors, people willingly committing sin or not really caring at all, and also people who have despaired of their salvation. We must never allow that to happen. So the devil can do one of two things. He can either lead us, tempt us into sin, or he can convince us that we cannot be saved. And this, because we despair of our salvation, we end up sinning. Then shall be gluttony and revilings and drunkenness, wherefore also most of all he puts forth an example corresponding to this thing. In other words, he makes an analogy by citing Noah and the ark. For like as when the ark was being made, they did not believe. He said, but while it was set in the midst of them, proclaiming beforehand the evils to come, they, when they saw it, lived in pleasure, just as though nothing dreadful was about to take place, so also now. The Antichrist indeed shall appear, after whom is the end. And then the punishments at the end and the vengeance intolerable. But they that are held by intoxication of wickedness shall not even perceive the dreadful nature of the things that are on the point of being done. So there will be signs, but the people who are living in wickedness, especially extreme wickedness, and I think we're getting closer to that time, they will not even recognize what's about to happen because they're just too busy sinning, I suppose. So here's a part that mentions a thing that people cite for the rapture. Then 2 men will be in the field, one is taken, one is left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one is taken and one is left. Watch therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the householder had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have watched and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore also you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So the point of the images is that the coming of the Son of Man will take people by surprise. And there will be 2 categories of people. People who are prepared and will be saved, and those who will be caught by surprise and will be lost. And they won't necessarily be obvious. This is why he's describing 2 people involved in the same kind of work. And this so-called rapture language, which is where people get the idea of the rapture, is that 2 people who seem to be the same will have very different outcomes, very different fates. One person will be brought into the kingdom of heaven and the other will not. Remember that this follows his description of the coming of the Lord and sending the angels to gather the elect. This is an image of judgment. Now, this particular passage, along with 1 Thessalonians in chapter 4, are the most common that are used to support the idea of the rapture. And here's what it says in 1 Thessalonians. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, and with the archangel's call, and with the sound of the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And we shall always be with the Lord. So why do these two passages, and then they try to find others, scrounge around for other little passages to support this idea. Why do these not describe what the rapture is? Most Christians who believe this say that the Lord will come back and he will snatch up, that's what the word is for rapture. Rapture means they snatch up, take people up into heaven. The elect or the chosen or the people who are the believers, the true believers, will be suddenly disappear from this earth. They will be taken up to heaven, and then the rest of us will be left on earth in this horrible tribulation that we're going to suffer through. That's what the rapture is, okay? So why should we not believe the rapture? Why is it a fantasy? It's a fallacy. It is certainly not the truth. First of all, and primarily because this is an entirely human tradition, a human invention, an invented doctrine. And what we see in both of these passages about the men working in the field, and one is taken and one is left, the woman grinding, one is taken and one is left, or here with what St. Paul describes, that the dead in Christ will rise first, those of us who are alive will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. Those are things that describe what's going to happen when the Lord returns, right? It's very clear. There's going to be a trumpet. That might be not necessarily the actual sound of a trumpet, but something that heralds the coming of the Lord. He's going to come in the clouds with angels and trumpets, something which will get our attention. We will recognize that he has come. The dead, Paul mentions the dead will be raised first. This is our epistle reading for the Orthodox funeral service. And then the rest of us will be caught up and taken to be with the Lord. This is an image of judgment, okay? We're going to discuss the last judgment in a couple of weeks. Now, why do Protestants believe that this is just describing something which will happen only for the believers, and that means that the believers will be spared the tribulations of the end times? Where does this idea of the rapture, that is, something special that will happen only for the faithful. Obviously, only the faithful will be taken up to heaven. That's for sure. But here when he speaks about the faithful being taken up into heaven and the dead being raised first, he is speaking of judgment. Why does he say that the faithful will be taken up into heaven, or that two will be working and only one will suddenly be taken? He's indicating by comparing two people in a similar situation in life, not everyone is going to be saved. Okay? Even though they seem to be identical. Two priests, only one will be saved. Two attorneys, only one will be saved. It doesn't mean that suddenly people are going to disappear from the earth, and somebody who's driving, suddenly they'll be gone and the car's going to crash and people will be shopping and they'll suddenly disappear. Anything like that. That's nonsense. That's drama. That's made up by people who are making a lot of money presenting these ideas as fact. We don't interpret the Bible by taking things totally out of context. This is clearly a reference to the second coming of Christ. Why will people on earth be taken up? Why? What he's trying to say here is that the people who have already died will be raised, of course, for judgment. The people who are still alive, they're not going to die first before they're taken up. They're going to, St. Paul mentions this elsewhere, in the twinkling of an eye, we will be changed. In other words, when the Lord comes, the people who are still alive will not have to die first in order to be judged. They're going to be immediately transformed. That's what it's trying to say, okay? Now, the believers, of course, will be with the Lord. So why do people believe this complete fallacy, and how did it get started? The idea of the rapture, as is taught today by people, was invented by a man named John Darby around the year 1830. So it's less than 200 years old, this nonsense. And he supposedly had a private revelation from the Lord that he would take up the believers before the end times so that they would be spared the tribulation of the last days of the earth, the end times. Now, the fact that this is the idea of one person who claimed to have a private revelation is reason enough not to believe it. I don't know why anybody would believe this. And Protestants have the nerve to criticize us for following the traditions that we received from the apostles, and yet they believe this. idea that came from one person who concocted these different, first he had the idea, okay? And then he found verses in the Bible to try to support this nonsense. Why would anyone want to believe a notion that first has made its appearance less than 200 years ago by one person? Would you really hang your hat and your salvation on this idea? And you are hanging your salvation on this idea if you're believing that you're going to be raptured and you're not going to have to be prepared to suffer for Christ if you're living through the end times. When did Jesus ever say we won't have to suffer for him? And on the contrary, he says the opposite. So Darby was a false prophet. Remember, in so many places in this whole chapter, Jesus is warning us against false prophets. This fellow who invented this doctrine, which has been swallowed hook, line, and sinker by millions of Christians, was a false prophet. And any Christian who believes in the rapture as it's currently taught is following false prophecy, false teaching, and it's dangerous. Now, the first reason not to believe it is because it was invented by one person only recently. We don't believe doctrines that are invented by one person who believes or has this kind of idea that somehow he was taught this secret from the Lord. Since when do we do this? Nobody does that. You wouldn't accept that of anything else. Why accept it here? We're going to get to why in a minute. Number two, the second reason not to believe it. Because it is absolutely unimaginable that there would be such a teaching about the end times that was unknown to any Christian before the year 1830. Does that make sense to you? That no Christian on the face of the earth ever had such a notion until it suddenly came to the mind of this one person in the year 1830. Another reason to reject it. Number three, this doctrine is not supported anywhere in the scriptures. It is only created and supported by putting together isolated verses taken out of their context. This is done by heretics. Yes, this is heresy. This is done by heretics. And I'll tell you, the first person to make this analogy is, if you have to create a doctrine by taking verses out of context, of course, this is something which a lot of Protestants do, unfortunately. They create a whole doctrine by lifting one verse out of its context and making it an absolute, treating it as though we can ignore everything that came before it and everything that came after it. And St. Irenaeus said that this is what heretics do. They treat the scriptures like a mosaic. You know, a mosaic is lots of pretty little colored stones or colored pieces of glass that make a beautiful picture. And Irenaeus said that heretics take a mosaic of the king, a mosaic portrait of the king, and they rearrange the colors in it to make a portrait of a dog, and they say it's the same thing. Because that's what they do with the scriptures. They rearrange the scriptures to create their own doctrines. That's what heretics do. That image was created or given to us by St. Irenaeus, who was fighting heresies in the 2nd century. The Bible is not a set of isolated verses that can be rearranged independently of each other, taken out of context to create whatever doctrine you want. Okay, this is not how you honestly interpret the Bible. This is dishonest. This is Bible abuse. That's what it is. The Bible can only be understood in its context. And I don't mean only the immediate context. What is St. Paul talking about here? What is Jesus talking about here? I'm talking about the context of the entire Bible. That has to be taken into consideration. Where in the Bible does it suggest anything like a rapture? That's the fourth reason not to believe in the rapture. The rapture cannot be true because nowhere in the Bible does the Lord ever promise that the faithful will be spared the tribulations of the end, either the tribulations of our own times or the tribulations of the end times. As a matter of fact, he tells us we have to expect tribulation. He tells us to expect to be persecuted, especially in the book of Revelation, which is the only book that's really about the end times. Nowhere does Revelation describe anything like a rapture. Why not? Because it's not true. And the whole point of the book of Revelation is to encourage the faithful to remain faithful in spite of tribulations. It doesn't promise that the believers will be spared the suffering of the end times. So to believe the theory of the rapture is to deny the words of Christ, that we must be prepared to suffer for him. And this is what the whole book of Revelation is about. It talks about the patient endurance of the saints, that they will be tested through the end times. And there's a constant call for the endurance of the saints. They weren't raptured. What do you think is going to happen? Why does the whole book of Revelation talk about the endurance of the saints and how they have to be endure in spite of these difficult times? There's only one event in the book of Revelation that I can think of in which the faithful are spared those tribulations, and that's the stinging of the locusts. Okay, everything else they're going to have to endure. Okay, so you can't ignore this is very similar to the idea of predestination. There are a couple of verses that seem in the Bible that seem to suggest predestination. So people say, you see, some people are destined to be saved, some people are destined to be damned, and there's nothing you can do about it. In order to reach that conclusion from those verses, you have to ignore the entire rest of the Bible, in which we are constantly called to repent and return to God. If that's not possible, why is the whole Bible about that? If it's not possible to be saved because we choose to be saved, and there is no such thing as predestination, you've got 99% of the Bible suggesting that we have to choose to live a life and be saved by God, that we determine that outcome. We're not predestined. Why are you ignoring the 99% in order to focus on a couple of verses that you think are saying this? It's the same thing with the rapture. Again and again and again and again, the Lord tells us to persevere. The one who endures to the end will be saved. He tells us to expect tribulations, to be prepared for them. The whole church has always taught that. And now somebody comes along 200 years ago and says, oh, well, you don't have to worry about that. You're not going to have to face tribulations. What a crock. What a crock. Number 5, the fifth reason not to believe in the rapture is because to believe in the rapture requires that you believe in a third coming of Jesus Christ. Not just a second coming, but a third coming. Think about this. He would have to return a third time. If he comes at the second coming, only to rapture up the believers. Remember, it says that when the Lord comes, they will be taken up to meet the Lord in the air. That's the idea behind the rapture. So when the Lord comes, when we know he's going to come in glory, he's going to come and everybody's going to see him. Are you telling me that only the faithful will be taken up and there won't be a judgment? Okay, if only the faithful are taken up, he's going to have to come back a third time to judge the world, right? Where does the Lord ever say he's going to come a third time? Okay, because these passages are clearly about the second coming of Christ. So when it says that one was taken and another one was left, it means that the first person will be taken up, will be saved, and the other one will not. Two people are standing in church. One will be taken and the other will not. Does not mean that they're suddenly going to disappear from the face of the earth. It means that one person will be saved and another person who looks identical, as an identical situation, will not be saved. Okay, it's not a physical description of people disappearing suddenly from the earth, but an image to show that we cannot know by looking at a person who will be saved and who will not be saved. People who appear to be identical or in the same situation are not really, and only God knows, because God will judge them. Okay, so this idea of who's going to enter the kingdom and not is a matter of judgment. If the rapture is true, the Lord will have to come back a third time because he's already taken the believers up to heaven at the second coming, right? So when is he going to judge everyone? Will he only judge the believers the first time, or is he going to judge them secretly? This is what some people say. Secretly, he's going to come back. That's the only way they can be raptured up at the second coming, if he comes secretly and nobody knows it. But again and again and again and again, the Lord says that when he comes, he's going to come in the glory of his angels with a trumpet sound, on the clouds of heaven. Everybody who sees him the unbelievers will mourn. So he's going to come in a very visible way that everyone will see. There can't be a secret second coming in which only the believers are raptured up. Can you see how this doesn't make sense? Can you see how this is a bunch of nonsense? He can't judge everyone secretly and silently, rapture up the believers, and then leave the rest of the world to suffer through tribulations, and then come back a third time to judge the world. Can you see how believing in the rapture requires you to believe in a third coming of Jesus Christ? The Bible is very clear. It says that when the Lord returns, he will judge everyone in the world. Everyone will be there, and we're going to see that coming up in chapter 25. So the scenario that's created by the rapture theory is impossible unless you believe in three comings of Christ. The Lord is warning us against this. So we're going to end up our final passage here with this parable. Chapter 24, verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. Truly I say to you, he will send him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats and drinks with the drunken, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will punish him, and will put him in with the hypocrites. There men will weep and gnash their teeth. So here again, notice that following after this section, which is supposed to be about the rapture, the Lord is talking about his second coming, which will happen suddenly, and people will not know when it is going to happen. He's not going to come suddenly and take away some of the servants, right, and reward them secretly, and then punish the other ones who are left behind. He's not saying anything like that. Instead, he's saying the one servant who is doing what he ought to be doing, and we are the servants. We're supposed to be the ones who are behaving in the way that we ought to be behaving. We will be rewarded. And those who are not prepared, like the people who are eating and drinking as the ark was being built in their presence, and eating and drinking and sinning, they will suffer. So the other servant begins misbehaving, and when the master arrives, he will be punished. And this is something which is very commonly understood in the Orthodox tradition. This is why we don't fall for things like the rapture and this other nonsense, because we follow the ancient tradition of the church. And this story about the wicked servant is reflected in one of our most famous hymns of Holy Week, Idou o nymphios erchete. Behold, the bridegroom comes in the middle of the night, and blessed is the servant whom he will find watching. We sing that on 3 nights of Holy Week. Even 4 nights if you count Holy Wednesday, if you have the of that bridegroom service also. You know, the Orthodox Church is very biblical, and this teaching comes straight out of the Bible. We are to be careful that the Lord is coming in the middle of the night. This does not support the idea of a rapture, but the idea of judgment. And judgment immediately upon the coming of the Lord is incompatible with the scenario created by people who promote the rapture. And I want you to understand that the people who promote the rapture are also following this. Do you know how many millions of dollars have been made by people who had the Left Behind books and the Left Behind movies? It's a sensationalism that isn't biblical, and they've become wealthy over it. They have no interest in following really what the Bible actually says. They want you to believe that so that you will buy their books and watch their movies and listen to their lectures and other things. It's not just the Left Behind series, but book after book after book after book, and preacher after preacher after preacher talking about the rapture, and it's a crock. It's a lie. It was invented by one person. So don't criticize the Orthodox. If you're a Protestant watching this, you're criticizing the Orthodox because we believe in the traditions of men. We're not following traditions of men. You're following traditions of men. A tradition of one man. We follow the traditions of the Lord. We're following the scriptures where they speak about judgment, 2 servants, 2 men in the field, 2 women grinding, means identical status, identical roles. One be like the 2 servants. One is misbehaving and is unprepared for the master's return, and the other one is behaving exactly as he ought to and will be rewarded by the master. This is an image of judgment. The master does not come back secretly and reward the good servant under the table and then punish the evil servant. Nowhere ever does the Lord suggest that he will secretly come and remove some people and rapture them up so that they don't have to worry about suffering for him, and instead they're going to be immediately taken up into paradise. Okay, so let's listen to St. John Chrysostom as we conclude this. For this reason, he does not tell them when he will return, in order that they may watch, that they may always be ready. Therefore he said, when you're not looking for it, then he will come, desiring that they should be anxiously waiting and continually virtuous in action. But his meaning is like this: if the common sort of men knew when they were going to die, they would surely strive earnestly at that hour. In order, therefore, that they may strive not at that hour only, he tells them neither the common hour, that is, when he's returning, or the hour of each, meaning his death, desiring that they ever be looking for this, that they always be striving. Therefore he made the end of each man's life uncertain. He also made his coming uncertain, so that we will always be pursuing virtue, a Christian way of life and thought, so that we will always be praying, always seeking the Lord, always repenting. This is what the Lord expects from us. Not to be looking to figure out when he's going to come back, not to be self-satisfied thinking that we're going to be raptured. We won't have to worry about any of those things like suffering for the Lord. So the Lord gives us this lesson consistently, to be faithful, to persevere, to endure to the end so that we will be saved. He doesn't say he's going to rapture anyone. He's not going to spare anyone the tribulations. And instead, we're called to endure our trials and tribulations to the end, whether the end comes through ordinary circumstances or whether the end comes with the coming of the Lord. And we have to live through those end times in which there will be great suffering and tribulation. That might happen for us. But the point is that the Lord tells us repeatedly to expect tribulation. Never does he promise that we'll be snatched up, and never in any part of the Bible does it say that directly. You can only hold that belief if you are taking verses out of context, creating a doctrine that pleases you, that is not in fact true at all. So we stayed over a little bit longer, well, half an hour longer, but I hope you found that useful. Next week, we're going to continue with chapter 25, more of the eschatological discourse. So don't forget to go to drjeannie.com, drjeannie.com. Sign up for the newsletter by clicking on the button under my picture. You'll get my upcoming speaking schedule and there's always articles in there answering people's questions. Last time we talked about whether or not Mary Magdalene was really a prostitute. I continue to talk about orthodoxy in Alaska. So there are a wide variety of short articles, and it's completely free. So do sign up for the newsletter and join me next week as we continue the eschatological discourse. And now let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word, for our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.
Depart in peace according to thy word, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation, O